All right, moving now into our next section of the CFA Level 1 program curriculum readings. Now on the unit of economics. Economics is one of the major unit topics in our CFA Level 1 program curriculum. And we're just going to start commencing the reading for economics. So we're going to have a total of 2 study sections for Economics 1 and Economics 2, each with their own individual readings. Topic level learning outcomes. The candidate should be able to demonstrate knowledge of microeconomics and macroeconomics principles. The next study session introduces fundamental microeconomics and macroeconomics concepts relevant to financial analysis and investment management. Microeconomic factors such as a firm's competitive or non-competitive environment and its pricing strategies may be critical inputs for cash flows for forecasting and bottom-up security selection approaches. Economic output, global trade flows, monetary and fiscal policies, and the business cycle are key considerations for considering top-owned investment analysis and economic forecasting. Candidates should be familiar with the material covered in the following prerequisites. Economic readings available in candidate resources on the CFA Institute website. Demand and supply analysis introduction, demand and supply analysis, consumer demand and supply analysis, the firm. Okay. Alright, so, economic study session for Economics 1. This study session has been introduced. Fundamental concepts of demand and supply analysis for individual consumers and firms. Also covered are various market structures, perfect competition, oligopoly, and monopoly, in which firms operate. Key macroeconomics concepts and principles then follows, including aggregate output and income measurements, aggregate demand and supply analysis, and analysis of economic growth factor. The study session concludes with coverage of the business cycle and its effect on the economic activities. Reading assignments. Reading 14 concerns the topics of in demand and supply analysis. Reading 15 is the firm and market structure. Reading 16 is aggregate output, prices, and economic growth. Reading 17 concerns understanding business cycles. Reading 14, topics in demand and supply analysis. By the end of this reading, the candidate should be able to calculate and interpret prices, income, and cross-price elasticities of demand and describe factors that affect each measures, compare substitutions and income effects, distinguish between normal goods and inferior goods, describe the phenomenon of diminishing marginal returns, determine and interpret break-even as shutdown points of production, describe how economies of scales and diseconomies of scales affect costs. Introduction. In a general sense, economics is the study of production, distribution, and consumption, and can be divided into 2 broad areas of study, macroeconomics and microeconomics. Macroeconomics deals with the aggregate economic quantities, such as national output and the national income, and is rooted in microeconomics, which deals with markets and decision makings of individual economic units, including consumers and businesses. Microeconomics is a logical starting point for the study of economics. Microeconomics classifies private economic units into 2 groups: consumers or household and firms. These 2 groups give rise respectively to the theory of the consumer and the theory of the firm as 2 branches of study. The theory of consumer deals with consumers, the demand for goods and services, but utility maximizing individuals, i.e. individuals who make decisions to maximize the satisfaction received from present and future consumption. The theory of the firm deals with supply of goods and services by profit maximizing firms. It is expected that the candidate will be familiar with the basic concepts of demand and supply. The material covered in detail is recommended prerequisites readings. In this reading, we will explore how buyers and sellers interact to determine transaction prices and quantities. The reading is organized as follows. Section 2 discusses the consumer or demand side of the market model. Section 3 discusses the supply side of the consumer good market, paying particular attention to the firm's costs. Section 4 provides a summary of key points in the reading. Part 2, demand analysis, the consumers. The fundamental model of the private enterprise economy is the demand and supply model of the market. In this section, we examine 3 important topics concerning the demand side of the model: elasticities, substitutions, and income effects, and normal and inferior goods. The candidate is assumed to have a basic understanding of the demand and supply model and to understand how a market covers the equilibrium price at which the quantity willing demand by consumers at the price is just equal to the quantity willing supply by the firms. Here we explore more deeply some of the concepts underlying the demand side of the model. 2.1 Demand concepts: the quantity of a good that consumers are willing to buy on the number of different variables. Perhaps the most important of these variables is the item's own price. In general, economists believes that a price of a good rises, buyers would choose to buy less of it. As the price falls, they buy more. This opinion is so nearly universal that it comes to be called the law of demand. Although a good's own price is important in determining consumers' willingness to purchase, other variables also influence that decision. Consumers' income, their tastes and preferences, and the price of other goods and services and that serve as substitutes or complements are just a few of the other variables that influence consumers' demand for a product or service. Economists attempt to capture all these influences in a relationship called the demand function. Function is a relationship that assigns a unique value to a dependent variable for any given set of values of a group of independent variables. Equation 1 is an example of a demand function. In equation 1, we are saying the quantity demanded for good X is a function of the price of good X and the consumer's income and price of the good Y. So quantity demand of some good X is equal to the function of the price of the good, the consumer's income, and the price of another good. So these are the three factors that we consider in the law of demand. Often, economists use simple linear equations to approximate real-world demand and supply functions in relevant ranges. Equation 2 illustrates a hypothetical example of our function of gasoline demand. Okay. So we have our slope, and we also have the quantity demand for gasoline was maybe given by estimation of what the demand curve looks like, where the quantity of gasoline demanded, or the QXD, is a function of the price of a liter of gasoline of PX, consumer's income of 1,000 euros, and the average price of an automobile is 1,000 euros. And given by PY, the signs of the coefficients of gasoline price are negative, the consumer's incomes are positive, reflects the relationship between these variables and the quantity of gasoline consumed. The negative sign on average automobile price indicates that if automobiles go up in price, fewer will likely be purchased and driven. Hence, less gasoline will be consumed. As discussed later, such a relationship will indicate that gasoline and automobiles have a negative price elasticity, or XED, as we will later know, are in fact complements. To continue our example, suppose that the price of gasoline, or PX, is 1 pound 48 pence per liter per house. Income when I is 50,000 pounds, and the price of the average automobile is 20,000. In this case, the function will predict that a pre-household monthly demand for gasoline will be 47.54 liters, calculated as follows. So literally just plug the numbers into the equation. Pre-calling, the income and automobile prices are measured in thousands. Note that the sign on the own price variable is negative. Thus, the price of gasoline rises per household consumption would decrease by 6.39 liters per month for every €1 increased. Oh, it's euro, not pounds. Never mind. €1 increase in gas price. Own price is used by economists to underscore that the reference is to the price of a good itself and not the price of some other good. In our example, there are 3 independent variables in a demand function and 1 dependent variable. If any one of the independent variables change, so does the quantity demanded. It is often desirable to concentrate on the relationship between the dependent variable and just one of the independent variables at a time. To accomplish this goal, we could hold that other independent variables constant and rewrite are constant and rewrite the equation. For example, to concentrate on our relationship between the quantity demanded of the good and its own price, or Px, we hold constant the value of income and price of the good y. In our example, these values are 50 and 20 respectively. This equation will then be rewritten as such. The quantity of gasoline demanded is a function of the price of the gasoline. Per household income and the average price of an automobile is this. Notice that the income and price of the automobile are not ignored. They are simply held constant, and they called collected in the new constant term of 57. And this. Notice that we can solve Px in terms of Qxd by rearranging equations 3, which gives us equation 4, which is as such. Equation 4 gives the price of gasoline as a function of the quantity of gasoline consumed per month, and is referred to as the inverse demand function. QD in equation 4 must be restricted to less than or equal to 57, so the price is not negative. The price of the inverse demand function is called the demand curve and is shown in Exhibit 1. So this is the demand curve. It is a downward sloping curve. The demand curve represents the highest quantity willingly purchased at each price, as well as the highest price willingly paid for each quantity. In this example, this household will be willing to purchase 47.54 liters of gasoline per month at a price of 1.48 liters. If price were to raise to 2.48 per liter, the household will be willing to purchase only 41.15 liters per month. This demand curve is drawn with price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. It can be collectively interpreted as specifying either the highest quantity a household would be will buy at a given price, or the highest price it will be willing to pay for a given quantity. In our example, at the price of 1.48 per liter, if the price were to raise by €1, households will reduce the quantity by 6.39 units, and to raise to 41.15 liters, the slope of the demand curve is measured as the change in price, or P, divided by the change in quantity, Q, which is standard as delta, which is stated as delta. In this case, the slope of the demand curve is the change of y divided by change of x, or the change in price divided by change in quantity, which is negative 0.156. In the general model of demand and supply can be highly useful in understanding directional changes in prices and quantities that result from shift in one curve or the other, often though we need to measure how a selection of quantities demanded or supplied is to change in an independent variable that affects them. This is the concept of elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. Fundamentally, all elasticities are calculated in the same way. They are ratios of percentage change. Let us begin with the sensitivity quantity demand to change in the own price. Damn, he is going really fast. I remember in my university economics class, he'd go, this is like week 2 or week 3 perhaps, after 1 or 2 lectures, 3 lectures, and they just go bullet points and I'll finish in just 4 pages, really fast. Okay. 2.2, own price elasticity of demand. In equation 1, we expressed the quantity demanded of some good as a function of several variables, one of which was the price of a good itself, the good's own price. In equation 3, we introduced a hypothetical household demand function for gasoline consumers. The function was given by a simple linear expression, QD equals 57 minus 6.3 9px. Using this expression, we were asked to how sensitive the quantity of gasoline demand is to change in price. We may say that whenever price changes by 1 unit, quantity changes by 6.39 units in the opposite direction. For example, if price was to rise by €1, quantity demanded would fall by 6.39 liters per month. The coefficient on the price variable, negative 6.39, could be the measure of sensitivity we are seeking. There is a drawback associated with that measure. However, it is dependent on the units in which we measure Q and P. When we want to describe the sensitivity of demand, we need to recall the specific units in which Q and P are measured, liters per month and euros per liters. In our example, this relationship cannot readily be extrapolated to other units of measure. For example, gallons and dollars. Economists therefore prefer to use a gauge of sensitivity that does not depend on units of measure. The metric is called elasticity. Elasticity is the general measure of how sensitive one variable is to another variable, and is expressed as the ratio of percentage change in each variable, or the percentage change in y over the percentage change in x, or delta y over delta x. In the case of own price elasticity of demand, the measure is illustrated in equation 5 as this. The equation expresses the sensitivity of quantity demanded to the change in price EPD, or the price elasticity of demand, is the goods own price elasticity and the price percentage change in quantity demanded provided a percentage change in price. This is what we call PED. This measures independent and units in which the quantity and prices are measured. If quantity demanded falls by $8 or 8%, not dollars, 8%, when prices rise by 10%, the elasticity of demand is simply negative 0.8. It does not matter whether we are measuring quantity in gallons per week or liters per day. And it does not matter whether we measure price in dollars per gallon or euros per liter. 10% is 10% and 8% is 8%. So the ratio of the first to second is still negative 0.8. We can expand equation 5 algebraically by noting that the percentage change in any variable x is simply the change in x multiplied by delta x divided by the level of x. So we can rewrite the equations using a few simple steps as follows. To get a better idea of price elasticity, it may be helpful to illustrate using our hypothetical demand function of this. When the relationship between two variables is linear, is equal to the slope of coefficient on px in the demand function. Thus, in our example, the elasticity of demand is negative 6.39 multiplied by the ratio of price to quantity. We need to choose a price at which to calculate the elasticity coefficient. Using our hypothetical original price of 1.48, we will find the quantity associated with that particular price by inserting 1.48 into the demand function as given in equation 3. So let's just insert it into the function, and we will find that Q equals 47.54 liters per month. As the result of our calculation is that the price of 1.48, the elasticity of our market demand function, is therefore negative 0.2. How do we interpret that value? It means simply that when price equals 1.48, a 1% rise in price will result in a fall in quantity demanded of 0.02%. In our example, when the price is 1.48 per liter, demand is not very sensitive to changes in price because 1% rise in price will reduce quantity demanded by only 0.2%. In this case, we would say that demand is inelastic. To be precise, when the magnitude, ignoring algebraic signs, of the own price elasticity coefficient has a value less than 1, demand is said to be inelastic. When the magnitude is greater than 1, demand is said to be elastic. And when elasticity coefficient is equal to negative 1, demand is said to be unelastic or unitarily elastic. Note that the law of demand holds on price elasticity of demand will always be negative because a rise in price will be associated with the fall in quantity demanded, but it could be either elastic or very sensitive to changes in price, or inelastic, insensitive to changes in price. In a hypothetical example, suppose the price of gasoline was very high, say €5 per liter. In this case, the elasticity coefficient will be negative 1.28. So yeah, okay. Because the magnitude of the elasticity coefficient is greater than 1, we know that demand is elastic at the price. In other words, at lower prices, 1.48 per liter, a slight change in the price of gasoline does not have much effect on the quantity demanded. But when gasoline is expensive, €5 per liter, consumer demand for gasoline is highly affected by changes in price. By examining equation 6 more closely, we can see that for a linear demand curve, the elasticity depends on where the curve we calculate it. The first term, the change in Q over change in P, or the delta Q over delta P, which is the inverse of the slope of the demand curve, remains constant along the entire demand curve. But the second term, or the P divided by Q, changes depending on where we are on the demand curve at a very low price. At very low prices, P divided Q is very small, so demand is inelastic. But at very high prices, Q is low and P is high. So the ratio P divided by Q is very high, and demand is therefore elastic. Exhibit 2 illustrates a characteristic of negatively sloped linear demand curves. Above the midpoint of the curve, demand is elastic, because below the midpoint, demand is inelastic, and the midpoint demand is unit elastic. Okay, so this is looking at the sections of the linear demand curve and seeing which point is elastic, unit elastic. Unit elastic means 1% increase in price leads to a 1% increase in 1% decrease in quantity demanded. And then actually we made videos on this, on price elasticity of demand and elasticities on this very channel for IB, for investment banking. So you guys could go and check that out if you are. If you don't, then just stay on this reading. 2.2.1 Extreme prices of elasticity. There are two special cases in which linear demand curves have the same elasticity at all points: vertical demand and horizontal demand curves. Consider a vertical demand curve as panel A, exhibit 3, and the horizontal demand curve as in panel B. In the first case, the quantity demanded is the same regardless of price. There is no demand curve that is perfectly vertical at all possible prices, but it is reasonable to assume that over some range of prices, the same quantity would be purchased at a slightly higher price or slightly lower price. Thus is the price range. Quantity demanded is not at all sensitive to price and would be said to be perfectly inelastic in the range. In the second case, or panel B, the demand curve is horizontal and gives at some given price. It implies that even a minute price increase or reduce demand to zero. But at that given price, the consumer would buy some large unknown amount. This situation is a reasonable description of demand curves facing an individual seller in a perfect competitive market, such as the wheat market. At the current market price of wheat, an individual farmer could sell all she has. If, however, she holds out for a price above market price, it is reasonable to believe that she would not be able to sell any at all. Other farmers' wheat is perfect substitute for hers, so no one would be willing to buy any of hers at a higher price. In this case, we will say that the demand curve facing a seller under conditions of perfect competition is perfectly elastic. 2.2.2 Predicting demand elasticity. Own price elasticity of demand is a measure of how sensitive the quantity demanded is to change in the price of a good or service, but what characteristics of the good or its market might be informative to determining whether demand is highly elastic. Perhaps the most important characteristic in whether there is close substitutes for the good in question. If there are close substitutes, if there are close substitutes for the good, then if the price rises even slightly, the consumer would tend to purchase much less of the good and switch to the less costly substitute. If there are no substitutes, however, then it is likely that the demand is much less elastic. Consider a consumer's demand for some broadly defined product, such as bread. There really is no close substitute for the entire category of bread, which includes all types from French bread to pita bread to tortillas, and so on. So if the price of all bread was to rise, perhaps a consumer will purchase a little less in each week, but probably not a significantly smaller amount. Now consider that the customers' demand for a particular baker's specialty bread instead of the category of bread as a whole. Surely there will be close substitutes for Baker Bob's whole wheat bread with sesame seeds than bread in general. We will expect then that the demand for Baker Bob's special loaf is much more elastic than for the entire category of bread. In addition to the degree of substitutability, other characteristics tend to be generally predictive of a good's elasticity of demand. These include the portion of the typical budget that is spent on the good, the amount of time that is allowed to respond to the changes in price, the extent to which the good is seen as necessary or optional, and so on. So luxury good, normal good, and inferior goods. That's basically it. In general, if consumers tend to spend very small portions of their budget on a good, their demand tends to be less elastic than if they spend a very large a large part of their income. Most people spend very little on toothpaste each month, for example, so it really does not matter whether the price is raised by 10%, they will probably still buy about the same amount. If the price of housing were to rise significantly, however, most households would try to find a way to reduce the quantity they buy, and at least in the long run. This example leads to another characteristic regarding price elasticity. For most goods and services, the long-run demand is much more elastic than the short-run demand. For example, if the prices for gasoline rise, we will probably not be able to respond quickly to reduce the quantity we consume. In the short run, we tend to be locked into modes of transportation, housing, and employment locations, and so on. With a longer adjustment period, however, we can adjust quantity consumed in response to changes in price by adapting new modes of transportation or reducing the distance of our commute. Hence, for most goods, long-run elasticity of demand is greater than short-run elasticity. Durable goods, however, tend to behave in the opposite way. If the price of washing machines were to fall, people might react quickly because they have an old machine they know will need to be replaced fairly soon. Anyways, so when prices falls, they might decide to go ahead and make the purchase. If the price of washing machines were to stay low forever, it is unlikely that a typical consumer will buy more of the machines over a lifetime. Knowing whether a good or service is seen to be discretionary or non-discretionary helps to understand its sensitivity to a price change. Faced with some percentage increase in price, consumers are much more likely to give up their Friday night restaurant meal, which is discretionary, than they are to cut back significantly on staples in their pantry, which are non-discretionary. The more a good is seen as being necessary, the less elastic its demand is likely to be. In summary, our own price elasticity of demand is likely to be greater, i.e. more sensitive for items that have more close substitutes, occupy a large portion of the total budget, and are seen to be are seen to be optional instead of necessary, or have longer adjustment times. Obviously, not all the characteristics operate in some direction for all goods, so elasticity is likely to be a complex result of these other characteristics. In the end, an eventual elasticity of demand for a particular good runs out to be an empirical fact that can be learned over from careful observations and often sophisticated statistical analysis. Elasticity of total expenditure. Because of the law of demand, an increase in price is associated with a decrease in the number of units demanded of some good or service, because what we can say about the total expenditure on the good. That is what happens to price. That is what happens to price times quantity when price falls. Recall the elasticity is defined as the ratio of the percentage change in quantity demanded to the percentage change in price. So if demand is elastic, a decrease in price is associated with a large percentage rise in quantity demanded. Although each unit of the good has a lower price, a sufficiently greater number of units are purchased so that total expenditure, price times quantity, will rise to price falls when demand is elastic. If demand is inelastic, however, a given percentage decrease in price is associated with a smaller percentage rise in quantity demanded. Consequently, when demand is inelastic, a fall in price brings about a fall in total expenditure. In summary, when demand is elastic, price and total expenditure moves in opposite directions. When demand is inelastic, price and total expenditure moves in the same direction. This relationship is easy to identify. In the case of a linear demand curve, recall that about midpoint demand is elastic, and below the midpoint demand is inelastic. In the upper section of Exhibit 4, total expenditure P multiplied by Q is measured as the area of the rectangle, whose base is Q and the height is P. Notice that as price falls, the area of the inscribed rectangles, each outlined with their own dotted or dashed line at first grows in size, becomes larger at the midpoint of the demand curve, and therefore becomes smaller as price continues to fall and total expenditure declines towards zero. In the lower section of Exhibit 4, total expenditure is shown for each quantity purchased. Okay. So elasticity and total expenditure. We have total expenditure, we're increasing, and then we reach the maximum, and then we decrease. In the inelastic range of fall in price accompanies a fall in the total expenditure, and the elastic range of fall in price accompanies the rise in the total expenditure. The relationship as described hold for any demand curve, as it so does not matter whether we are dealing with the demand curve of the individual consumer, the demand curve of the market, or the demand curve facing any given seller. For a market, the total expenditure by buying becomes the total revenue to sellers in the market, and it follows then that the market demand is elastic. A fall in price will result in an increase in total revenue to sellers as a whole. And if demand is inelastic, a fall in price will result in a decrease in total revenue to sellers. If the demand faced by any given seller were inelastic and the current price, that seller could increase revenue by increasing its price, but because demand is negatively sloped, the increase in price would decrease total units sold, which will almost certainly decrease total production costs. If raising both price increases revenue and decreases costs, such a move would always be profit enhancing. Faced with elastic demand, faced with inelastic demand, one product seller will always be inclined to raise the price until the point at which demand becomes elastic. 2.3, income elasticity of demand. YED. Okay. Oh, it's IED. I thought I is investment in terms of macroeconomics, but who cares? Who cares what they denote it as? Elasticity is a measure of how sensitive one variable is to change in the value of another variable. Up to this point, we have faced on price elasticity, but the quantity of demanded of a good is also a function of consumer income. Income elasticity of demand is defined as a percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in income, holding all other things constant as shown in equation 7. The structure of this expression is identical to the structure of own price elasticity given in equation 5. All elasticity measures that we will examine have the same general structure and other things that change in the independent variable of interest. For example, if the income elasticity of demand for some given good has the volume of 0.8, we will interpret that the mean of the whatever income rises by 1%. The quantity demanded for each price will raise by 0.8%, although own price elasticity of demand will almost always be negative. Income elasticity can be negative, positive, or zero. Positive income elasticity means that as income rises, quantity demanded also rises. Negative income elasticity of demand means that when people experience a rise in income, they buy less of the good, such as inferior goods, and when income falls, they buy more of the same good. Goods with positive income elasticity are called normal goods. Goods with negative income elasticities are called inferior goods. Typical examples of inferior goods are rice, potatoes, or less expensive cuts of meat. We will discuss the concept of normal and inferior goods in a later section. In our discussion of demand curve, we hold all things constant, including consumer income, to plot the relationship between price and quantity demanded. If income were to change, the entire demand curve will shift one way or the other for normal goods. A rise in income will shift the entire demand curve upwards to the right for inferior goods. However, a rise in income would result in downward and leftward shift of the entire demand curve. 2.4 cross price elasticity of demand. We previously discussed a good's price elasticity. However, the price of another good might have an impact on the demand of the good or service. And we should be able to define the elasticity with respect to other prices, or PY, as well. The elasticity is called the price elasticity of demand and takes on the same structure as own price elasticity of income elasticity of demand as represented in equation 8. Note how similar this equation is to the equation of own price elasticity. The only difference is that the subscript of P is now Y, and Y is indicates some other good. This price elasticity of demand measures how sensitive the demand for good X is to the changes in the price of some other good Y, holding all other things constant for some pair of goods X and Y. When the price of Y rises, more of the good X is demanded. This cross-price elasticity of demand is positive. The good, also referred to as substitutes. In economics, the cross-price elasticity of two goods is positive. They are substitutes, irrespective of whether someone would call them similar. This concept is intuitive if you think about two goods that are to be close substitutes, perhaps two brands of beer. When the price of one of your favorite beer brand rises, you will probably buy less of that brand and more of a cheaper brand. So the cross-price elasticity of demand will be positive for substitute goods. An increase in price in the price of one good will shift the demand curve for the other good upwards and to the right. Alternatively, two goods whose cross-price elasticity of demand is negative are said to be complements. Typically, the goods tend to be consumed together as a pair, such as gasoline and automobiles, or houses and furnitures. With automobiles prices fall, they may expect the quantity of autos demand to rise, and thus we may expect a rise in demand for gasoline. Whether two goods are substitutes or complements might not be immediately intuitive. For example, grocery stores often put things like coffee on sale in the hope that customers will come for coffee and end up doing their weekly shopping there as well. In that case, coffee and, say, cabbage are very well empirically turned out to be complements, even though we would not think of the price of coffee has any relation to sales of cabbage, regardless of whether someone will see two goods as related in some fashion. If the cross-price elasticity of two goods is negative, then they are complements. Although a conceptual understanding of demand elasticity is helpful in sorting out qualitative and directional effects among variables, using an empirically estimated demand function can yield insight into the behavior of a market. For illustration, let us return to our hypothetical individual demand function for gasoline in equation 2, duplicated here for convenience. The quantity demanded of a given good are QXD, QDX. As the function of its own price, P of X, PX. Consumer income, I, and the price of another good, PY. To derive market demand function, the individual consumer demand function are simply added together. If there were 1,000 individuals who represented a market and they all held identical demand functions, the demand function will be the individual's consumer demand functions multiplied by the number of consumers using the individual demand function gives the equation 2. The market demand function will be as shown as equation 9. So we always multiply it by the quantity of the consumers. Earlier, when we calculate own price elasticity of demand, we needed to choose a price at which to calculate the elasticity coefficients. Similarly, we need to choose actual values for the independent variable Px, I, and Py, and insert these values into the estimated market demand function to find the quantity demanded, choosing 1.48 for Px, 50 in thousands for I, and 20 in thousands for PY. We find that the quantity of gasoline demanded is 47,543 liters per month. We now have everything we need to calculate own price income and cross-price elasticity of demand for own markets. These elasticities are expressed in equation 10, 11, and 12. Each of these expressions has a term denoted and changed in quantity divided by the change in each respective variable own price, the delta and Q over the delta and P, income, the cross price. We are stated in the discussion of own price elasticity when the relationship between two variables is linear, the change in quantity, or the delta QD, divided by the change in own price, the change in PX, income, and I, delta I, or cross price, or delta, the equation of slope coefficient. And on other variables, the elasticities are calculated by inserting the slope coefficient from equation 9 into the elasticity formulas. Own price elasticity, we just plug it in. Income elasticity, we just plug it in. So here's the cross-price elasticity. We literally just plug it in, multiply it, divide it, and we get that. In our example, at price of 1.48, our price elasticity of demand is negative 0.2. A 1% increase in price of gasoline leads to a decrease in quantity demanded of about 0.2%. Equation 10, because the absolute value of their price elasticity is less than 1. We characterize demand as being inelastic as the price. For example, an increase in price will result in an increase in total expenditure on gasoline by consumers in that market. That income elasticity of demand is 0.62, equation 11, as 1% increase in income will result in an increase of 0.26% in the quantity demanded of gasoline. Because that elasticity is positive but small, we would characterize gasoline as a normal good. The cross-price elasticity of demand between gasoline and automobiles is negative 0.484 in equation 12. If the price of automobiles rose by 1%, the demand for gasoline will fall by 0.484%. We would therefore characterize gasoline as and automobiles as complements because the cross-price elasticity is negative.
The magnitude is quite small. However, we will want to conclude that the complementary relationship is weak. Example 1, calculating elasticities from a given function, demand function. An individual consumer monthly demand is downloadable for downloadable ebooks is given by the equation this, where this is equal to the number of ebooks determined each month, demanded each month. I is equal to the household monthly income, and PEB equals the price of the ebooks, and PHB equals the price of the hard-bounded books. Assume that the price of an ebook is this much, household income is this much, and the price of a hard-handed book is this much. Determine the value of own price elasticity of demand for ebooks. Determine the income elasticity of demand for ebooks. Determine the price elasticity of demand for ebooks with respect to own price of the hard-bounded books. The own price elasticity of demand, you literally just plug it in, you get the result. Also similar to these, also similar to that. Okay. 2.5, substitution and income effects. The law of demand states that if nothing changes other than the price of a particular good or service itself, a decrease in the good's price will tend to result in a greater quantity of the good being purchased. Simply stated, it is the assumption that a demand curve has a negative slope, that is, where prices per unit is measured on the vertical axis, the quantity demanded per time period is measured on the horizontal axis. The demand curve is falling from the left to right as shown in Exhibit 5. There are two reasons why a consumer would be expected to purchase more of a good when its price falls and less of a good when its price rises. These two reasons are known as the substitution effect and the income effect of a change in price, or the change in price. We address these two effects separately and then examine the combination of the two. When the price of something, say gasoline, falls, they really like to give the example of gasoline. I wonder why. They like gold, black gold. Falls, the good becomes relatively less costly compared with other goods or services of consumers might purchase. For example, gasoline is used in driving to works. So when the price falls, it is relatively cheaper to drive to work and take public transportation. Hence, consumers is likely to substitute a little more driving to work for a little less public transportation. When the price of beef falls, it becomes relatively cheaper than chicken. Yeah, right. When is beef cheaper than chicken? The typically consumer is therefore less likely to purchase a little more beef and a little less chicken. On its own, the substitution effect suggests that when the price of something falls, consumers tend to purchase more of that good. But another influence is often at work as well. The income effect. Consider a consumer spending all of her money income on a given combination of goods and services. Her money income is simply the quantity of dollars or euros or other relevant currency that is available for her to spend in any given time period. Now suppose the price of something that she wants regularly purchased falls while her money income and the price of other goods remains unchanged. Economists refers to an increase in purchasing power or real income for most goods and services. Consumers tend to buy more of them when their income rises. So when the price of goods, say beef, falls, more consumers will tend to buy more beef because the increase of their real income. So it's not the real income that changes, it's the price of beef that changes. And because price of beef is cheaper, your real income is higher because they can now buy more of the beef. Okay. Although the consumer's money income, the number of her paychecks, is assumed not to have changed, her real income has risen because she can now buy more beef. That's literally what I just said. And other goods too, as a result of the fall in the price of the one good. So quite apart from the substitution effect of a fall in the goods price, the income effect tends to cause consumers to purchase more of the good as well. Substitution and income effects works in other ways too. If the price of beef were to rise, the substitution effect would cause the consumer to buy less of it and substitute more chicken for the now relatively more expensive beef. Additionally, the rise in the price of beef results in a decrease in consumers' real income because now she can buy less goods with same amount of money income. If beef is a good that consumers tend to buy more of when their incomes rises and less of when their incomes fall, then a rise in beef price would have an income effect that causes the consumers to buy less of it. Uh, 2.6 normal and inferior goods. Economists classify goods on various dimensions, one of which relates to how consumers purchase of a good response to changes in consumer income. Earlier, when discussed income elasticity of demand, we introduced the concept of normal goods, inferior goods. For example, for goods and services, an increase in income will cause consumers to buy more. These are called normal goods. But that does not hold true for all goods. There are some goods that consumers buy less of when their incomes rise, and those are what we call inferior goods. This section will distinguish between normal goods and inferior goods. We previously discussed income substitution effects of changes in price. If a good is normal, a decrease in price will result in consumers buying more of that good. Both the substitution effect and the income effect are at play here. A decrease in price tends to cause consumers to buy more of the good in place of other goods. The substitution effect, the increase in real income resulting from a decline in goods price, causes people to buy even more of the good when its price falls, the income effect. So we could say for normal goods, restaurants, meals, for example, as most people tend to eat out more often when their income rises, the substitution effect of the income effect reinforce one another to cause the demand curve to be negatively sloped. For inferior goods, cheaper cuts of meat or generic beverages, for example, which people buy less of as their income rises, and increase in income causes consumers to buy less, not more. And if their incomes falls, they buy more, not less. Inferior does not imply anything about the quality of the good. It is simply used to refer as a good in which an increase in income causes some people to buy less of it. The same good could be normal for some consumers, while it is inferior for others, considered a very low income segment of the population. For those consumers, an increase in their income might very well result in them buying more fast food meals that may take some of the added income they enjoy eating out at fast food restaurants a little more often. Now consider a high income group. In their income rises, if their income rises, they might be much less inclined to eat fast food and instead go for dining in fashionable French bistros, for example. So fast food meals might be a normal good for some people and an inferior good for others. Let us now consider the substitution and income effects of a change in the price of a normal good and inferior good. The substitution effects say that the price of a good falls, the consumers will substitute more of this good. If the consumption bundles buys less of the same good or same other good, the substitution effect is true for both normal and inferior goods. Next, we provide an example. We begin with a hypothetical consumer with a certain monthly income of $20,000. $200,000, given the price of all goods, he makes a decision to buy a given amount of good X coffee. If the price of coffee falls, the consumer is better off than when the price was higher. We can assume that the consumer would have been willing to pay some amount of money each month to be able to buy coffee at a lower price. We now have two states of the world. In state one, he spends his income on all the various goods, including his desired quantity of coffee at the original price. In state two, he is able to buy coffee at the lower price. but coffee has paid a portion of its income to buy coffee at a lower price. He now has less money income, cash money, to spend on all goods combined. If we adjust this amount of money he would want to pay to lock in the lower price of coffee until he is just indifferent between the two states of the world, we would have exactly offset the good ding of the lower price with the bad ding of less income. The removal of income effects on the price decreases. Yeah, this is quite intuitive. Okay, continuing our example, assuming that we give back to the consumers the amount of money if he is willing to pay for the privilege of buying coffee at a lower price. Clearly, he is better off because he now can buy coffee at a lower price without having to pay for the privilege. We want to know whether with a higher money income, he will now buy more or less coffee at the lower price. The answer depends on whether coffee is normal or inferior good for this consumer. Recall that for normal goods, an increase in income causes consumers to buy more, but for inferior goods, an increase in income causes consumers to buy less. In conclusion, the substitution effect of a change in price of a good will always be the direction of buying more at the lower price or less at the higher price. The income effect of the same price changes, however, depends on whether the good is normal or inferior. If the good is normal, the income effect reinforces the substitution effect, both leading to a negatively sloped demand curve. But if the good is inferior and the income is but if good inferiors, the income effect and the substitution effect work in opposite directions. The income effect tends to mitigate the substitution effect. Example 6 summarizes the substitution and income effect and for normal and inferior goods. You can pause the video and look at it if you have some questions. Exceptions to the law of demand, some examples, not so much to talk about. Okay, I will continue this reading in our next section, and I hope my readings have been helpful. And tune in next time for our more readings on economics for the CFA Level 1 program curriculum. Without further ado, thank you for your time, and I hope to see you guys soon. Goodbye. Continued reading of the CFA Level 1 program curriculum. Supply analysis, the firm. To fully comprehend the supply side of the consumer good market, an analyst must understand the firm's cost. As a reminder, this reading builds on the basics of the market model as covered in the recommended prerequisite reading material. The firm's marginal cost is the fundamental foundation of the firm's ability and willingness to offer a given quantity for sale, and its cost depends on both the productivity of its inputs and their prices. In this section, we will describe the firm's cost curves, total average, and marginal costs in both the short run and the long run, paying special attention to what economists call the law of diminishing marginal returns. As well, we will then use this information to explore the conditions under which a firm would find it beneficial to continue operations, even if its economic profits are negative, and at which levels of production its shutdown and break-even points occur. Long-run costs will be examined in the context of economies and diseconomies of scale. 3.1 Marginal returns and productivity. There is an economic phenomenon known as the increasing marginal returns, in which marginal product, the productivity of each additional unit of resource, increases as additional units of the output are employed. Initially, a firm can experience increasing returns from adding labor to the production processes because of the concepts of specialization and labor and division of labor. At first, by having too few workers relative to total physical capital, the understaffing situation requires employees to multitask and share duties. As more workers are added, employees can specialize, becoming more adept at their individual functions and realize an increase in marginal productivity. But after a certain output level, the law of diminishing marginal returns becomes evident. Where more and more workers are added to the fixed capital base, the marginal returns of the labor factor eventually decreases because the fixed input restricts the output potential of additional workers. As an illustration, consider automobile production.
When an auto manufacturer plant is operating at full capacity, adding additional labor will not increase production because the physical plant is already 100% employed. More labor hours will merely add to cost without adding to output, assuming all workers are of equal quality and motivation. The decline in marginal product occurs in the short run, where all other resources, typically plant size, capital size, and technology, are fixed. Marginal returns are directly related to input productivity, a measure of the output per unit of input. 3.1 per 1 productivity, the relationship between production and cost. The cost of producing anything depends on the amount of inputs. Factors of production. These terms are synonymous, and input prices. Examples of factors of productions are employee hours, machine hours, raw materials, and so on. For simplicity, economists typically concentrate on only two inputs, labor and capital, although obviously there can be many inputs to particular production processes. The labor input is simply employee times, and it's measured as labor hours per time period, such as per week or per month. We denote labor hours as L. If a firm is using 2 laborers per week and each laborer works 35 hours per week, then L equals 70 labor hours per week. We denote hours of capital as K. If a firm is using 3 machines, each one is used 12 hours per week. The K is equal to 36 machine hours per week. That is, the capital input is measured by the machine hours used per time period. In this way, the capital and labor are stated in similar terms, in hours per week in this case. They represent flow of services, labor hours, and machine hours. They are used to produce a flow of output per time period. Accordingly, the respective input prices will be weighted rates per labor hour. We use W to denote wage rates and rental rate per machine hour. We use R to denote the rental rate per machine hour. It is helpful to think of a firm as renting the services of labor and the machine. Although the firm might own its own machine, it can, in theory, rent the machines out to other users. So in foregoing the rate it could earn elsewhere when it is using the machine internally instead of renting it out. So a firm is not using its own machines for free, to say it is incurring opportunity costs of not being able to rent the machines to another user. The total cost of production, or the TC, is the number of hours of labor multiplied by the wage rate plus the number of machine hours multiplied by the rental rate of machines, which is denoted right here. This formula illustrates the total cost in just the cost of all the firm's inputs. It is not the cost of it is not a cost function, however, which is a relationship between the cost of production and the flow of output. The cost function is C equals F of Q, where Q denotes the flow of output in units of production per time period, relates to production costs over time period to the number of units of output produced per time period. Two things could cause the cost of production or producing any given level of output to fall. Either the price of one or both inputs could fall, or the inputs themselves could become more productive and less of them would be needed. E.g., a worker is more productive when fewer hours of labors are needed to produce the same output. The reverse is true. Also, a rise in the cost could result from either a rise in output prices or a fall in input productivity, or both. Why is productivity important? Cost minimization and profit maximization behavior dictates that the firm strives to maximize productivity. For example, produce the most output per unit or of inputs, or produce any given level of output which with the least amount of input. A firm that lags behind the industry in productivity is at a competitive disadvantage and is likely to face decrease in future earnings and a shareholder's wealth. An increase in productivity lowers production costs, which leads to greater profitability and investment value.
These productivity benefits can be fully or partially lower prices and to employees in the form of enhanced compensation, transferring some of all the productivity rewards to non-equity holding creates synergies and benefits shareholders over time. The benefits of increasing productivity are as follows: lower business costs, which translates into increased profitability, an increase in market value of equity and shareholders' wealth resulting from an increase in profit, and an increase in workers' reward, which motivates further productivity increases from labor. Undoubtedly, increases in productivity reinforce and strengthens the competitive position of a firm over the long run. A fundamental analysis of a company should examine the firm's commitment to productivity enhancement and degrees to which productivity is integrated into the competitive nature of the industry or market. In some cases, productivity is not only an important promoter of growth in firm value over the long term, but is also the key factor for economic survival. A business that lags the market in terms of productivity often finds itself less competitive, while at the same time confronting profit erosion and deterioration in shareholders' wealth. Typically, productivity measures for a firm are based on the concept of total product, average product, and marginal product of labor. Total, average, and marginal product of labor when measuring a firm's operating efficiency. It is easier for more practical to use a single resource factor as the input variable rather than a bundle of the different resources that the firm uses in production units of output. As discussed in previous sections, labor is typically the input that is the most identifiable and calculatable for measuring productivity. However, any input that is not difficult to quantify can be used. As an example, a business that manually assembles widgets has 50 workers, one production facility, and an assortment of equipment and hand tools. The firm would likely would like to assess its productivity when using these three inputs factors to produce widgets. In this example, it is most appropriate to use labor as the input factor for determining productivity because the firm uses only one or fixed plant building and a variety of other physical capital. We will use labor as an input variable to illustrate the concepts of total product plus average product, and marginal product. Exhibit 7 provides a summary of these three concepts. Here's Exhibit 7. The total product Q is defined as the aggregate sum of the production of a firm during a time period. As a measure of productivity, total product provides superficial information about how efficient or effective and efficient a firm is in terms of producing output. For instance, three firms, Company A, Company B, and Company C, that make up an entire industry, has a total output level of 100,000 units, 180,000 units, and 200,000 units, respectively. Obviously, Company C dominates the market with a 41.7 share, followed by Company B with 37.5 and Company A with 20.8% portion of the market. However, this information says little about how efficient each firm is generating its total output levels. Total product only provides insight into a firm's production volume relative to the industry. It does not show how efficient a firm is in producing its output. Average output of labor, or APL, measures the productivity of an input. In the case labor, on average, is calculated by dividing the total product by the total number of units for the given input that is used to generate that output. Average product is usually measured on the basis of labor input. It is a representative or overall measure of labor productivity. Some workers are more productive than average, Lamau, and others are less productive than average. Exhibit 8 compares the productivity of three firms introduced earlier. Company A employs 100 worker hours and produces 100 widget per hour. Company B employs 200 workers' hours and produces 180,000 widgets per hour. Company C employs 250 workers and worker hours and produces 200,000 widgets per hour. So here's the average product labor. So you just divide them. Using this metric, it's apparent that company A with APL or average product labor equal to 1,000 is the most efficient firm. Despite having the lowest market share, company C has the largest market share. What? Despite having the lowest market share, company C has the largest market share. That's kind of ironic. But it is the least efficient out of the three. With APL equaling to 800, assuming that a company A can maintain its productivity average over the long run, it will be positioned to generate the greatest return on investment through lower costs and higher profit outcomes relative to the other firm in the markets. Marginal product of labor, or MPL, also known as marginal return, measures the productivity of each additional unit of input and is calculated by observing the difference in total product when adding other units of input, assuming other resource quantities are held consistent or constant. It is a gauge of the productivity of the individual additional worker hour rather than an average across all workers. Exhibit 9 provides a numerical illustration for total, average, and marginal products of labor. So that's what it looks like. Total product increases as the firm adds each additional hour of labor until the 7th labor hour, at which point total production declines by 70 units. Obviously, the firm would want to avoid negative worker productivity or diminishing marginal returns. At an employment level of 5 labor hours or APLs of 80 units, at MPL, it's 40 units, which we'll get by this. The average productivity of all 5 labor hours is 80 units, but the productivity of the 5th labor hours is only 40 units. So example 3. So we don't have to go into the example. You could just pause the video and look at it if you have questions. A firm has a choice of using total product, average product, and marginal product to or some combination of the three to measure productivity, because total product is simply an indication of a firm's output volume and potential market share. Average product and marginal product are better gauges of a firm's productivity. Both can reveal competitive advantage through production efficiency. However, individual worker productivity is not easily measurable when workers perform tasks collectively. In this case, average product is the preferred measure of productivity performance. Referring to total product column in Exhibit 9, output is more than twice as great, 100 or 201 widgets, when 2 hours of labor are used as opposed to 1 hour, 100 widgets. In this rate of production, there are an increase in return when employee hours are added to the production process. This phenomenon is increasing marginal returns. 3.2, break-even and shutdown analysis. 2 important considerations for any firms are the level of profitability at whether to continue to operate in the current environment. Economists define profit differently than do accountants. Economic profit is defined as the difference between total revenue and the total economic cost. Accounting profits is defined between the total revenue and accounting costs, because they account for opportunity costs. That's it. Total revenue is the same as both an accounting standpoint as an economic standpoint. It is derived by multiplying the selling price of a unit of output and the number of units. TR equals P minus Q. So total revenue equals price multiplied by quantity. The difference between the two measurements of profit, therefore, lies in the understanding of economic costs, also called opportunity cost, which is defined in detail in the next section, 3.2.1, economic cost versus accounting costs. The opportunity cost of any particular decision, such as to produce a given level of output, can be determined by measuring the benefit foregone by not implementing the next best alternative. Suppose the firm is currently operating with hired labor and its own output or its own plant and equipment to produce output at some level. The firm must continuously decide either to keep the level of output and some or some or to change the decision to maintain the same output requires as the firm hire the same amount of labor inputs and use the same level of its capital inputs as before. The labor expense is both an economic cost and an accounting cost because the money spent on labor hours has to be used for something else, opportunity cost. And it is also a current expense for the firm or the accounting cost. Accountants typically attempt to recognize the cost of a plant and equipment in the form of accounting the depreciation, which is a means of distributing the historical cost of the fixed capital among the units of production for financial reporting purposes. The money spent in the past on the firm's plant and equipment is what economists call a sunk cost. Because sunk costs cannot be altered, they cannot affect an optimal decision, which is forward-looking. Sunk costs are therefore ignored, and the key management questions is going forward, what are the opportunity costs and benefits of maintaining a given level of output? Here is where economic depreciation comes into play. To understand the opportunity cost of using our plant and equipment already bought and paid for one more period of time to produce output, we have to ask the question, what else could be done that fixed capital if it were not used to produce our output? The question might be because there are no external markets of our machines in the building, we are foregoing nothing by using it to produce output, or it may be that it may be that there is a market where we can rent out or sell our capital equipment elsewhere instead of using it to produce our output. The rental rate is the economic depreciation associated with using our equipment to produce levels. No. Economic depreciation is forward-looking. It asks, what am I giving out if it uses my resources to produce output in an coming period? Accounting depreciation is backward-looking. It asks, how should I distribute the historical costs that I already paid across units of output that I intend to produce this period? Both concepts are useful, one for making managerial decisions about output and the other as a way of spending historical costs for reporting or tax purposes. But there is no necessarily a direct relationship between the two. 3.2.2 Marginal revenue, marginal cost, and profit maximization. It is assumed that any for-profit firm management is tasked for achieving a goal of shareholder wealth maximization. Put more simply, that translates into the goal of economic profit maximization. Hereafter, when the word profit is used, it will be economic profit that would be in mind. Because profit is defined as total revenue minus total cost, anything that increases revenue more than the cost or decreases the cost more than the revenue will increase profit. Before we address profit maximization, we must introduce two important concepts, marginal revenue and marginal cost. Marginal revenue, or MR, is the additional revenue the firm realizes from the decision to introduce output by 1 unit per time period. That is, marginal revenue equals the change in total revenue divided by the change in total quantity, or the change in the quantity. If the firm is operating in what economists call a perfectly competitive market, it is one of many sellers of identical products in an environment characterized by low and non-existent sellers of identical products in an environment characterized by low or non-existent barriers to entry. Under perfect competition, the firm has no pricing power because there are many perfect substitutes for the product it sells. If it were to attempt to raise the price by a very small amount, it will lose all of its sales to competitors. On the other hand, it can sell essentially any amount of product if it wants without lowering the price below the market price. Take the wheat market as an example of a perfectly competitive market. A seller of wheat may have no control over the market price of wheat. Thus, because TR equals price minus multiplied by quantity, marginal revenue for this firm is simply the price per output of price per unit of output. The firm is said to face a perfectly horizontal or zero slope or infinitely elastic demand curve for its product. For example, if a firm sells 1,000 bushels of wheat per week for 3 pounds per bushel, total revenue is 3,000. And if the firm were to increase its price by 1 unit, TR will be risen by exactly 3 pounds. The firm will not have to lower the price to sell any that additional unit. So for sellers in a market with perfect competition, our MP equals and marginal revenue equals P. In contrast, if a firm sells a product that is differentiated from from other firms' product and that has a larger market share, the firm is said to be operating in an environment of imperfect competition. In the extreme case of imperfect competition, there might be only one firm selling a product with no close substitutes. The firm holds a monopoly and is subject to the market demand curve for its products. Whether a monopoly or simply operating under imperfect competition, the firm faces a negatively sloped demand curve and must lower its prices to sell another unit. The MR will be lower than the price. To illustrate the concept, we will decompose MR. Recall from earlier in the reading, total revenue equals price multiplied by quantity. So this is what it looks like. A perfectly competitive firm faces a demand curve which with a slope of 0, substituting 0 for price, change in price over change in quantity into the expression given, it becomes clear that MR is equal to the price. For the perfectly competitive firm, it need not lower its price to sell an additional unit. For a firm in an imperfectly competitive market, however, the demand curve is negatively sloped, or what looks like this. Substituting the negative number into the expression of this, it becomes clear that MR is imperfectly competitive. Is an imperfectly competitive firm is less than the cost, the price. Marginal cost, MC, is the increase in total cost resulting from the firm's decision to increase output by 1 additional unit per time period. MC equals change in total cost divided by change in quantity. Economists distinguish between short-run marginal cost, or SMC, and long-run marginal cost, LMC. Labor is variable over the short run, but the quantity of capital cannot be changed in the short run because there is a lead time required to build or buy new plant equipment and puts it in place. In the long run, all inputs are variable. SMC is essentially the additional cost of an variable input labor that must be occurred to increase the level of output by 1 unit. LMC is the additional cost of all changing both labor and capital inputs in a way that maximizes efficiency. Understanding MC in aiding by recalling that cost is directly related to the input price of the inversely related productivity. For example, if the wage rates were to rise, costs would also rise. If labor were to become more productive, costs would fall. This relationship can be captured in expression that relates SMC and wage rates, or W and MPL, where SMC is equal to wage rate divided by MPL. This relationship between cost and productivity also holds with average variable costs. Variable costs are all costs that fluctuates with the level of production and sales. Average variable cost, AVC, is the ratio of the total variable cost of total output. AVC equals total variable cost divided by quantity. Again, the labor wages rises, AVC also rises, but if labor were to become productive, AVC falls. The relationship is captured in an expression of this. Earlier, we noted that over some range of low output, the firm might benefit from increasing marginal productivity of its labor inputs, and workers begun to specialize. As the MPL increases, SMC declines, or the short run a certain amount of marginal cost. Eventually, as more and more laborers are added to a fixed amount of capital, the MPL must fall, causing SMC to rise. We begin this section by stating that a goal of management is to maximize profit, but now address the conditions necessary for reaching that goal. Consider a firm currently producing 1,000 widgets each week, and whose management is contemplating increasing that output incrementally. Would that additional unit increase profit? Clearly, profit would be increased or losses reduced if the additional revenue of the firm next unit were greater than the additional cost. So a profit-seeking firm should increase Q if MR is greater than MC. Conversely, if the additional unit added if an additional unit added more to cost to the revenue, the firm should reduce output because it will save more in the cost than it will lose in revenue. Only if the additional costs were exactly equal to the additional revenue would the firm be maximizing its profit. There is another condition called the second order condition necessary for profit maximization at the level of output at which R equals MC. Where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This is where the firm maximizes its profit. Cannot be falling. This condition is fairly intuitive. If MC is falling with additional output, ML or MP would be rising. Recall that SMC is equal to W divided by MPL. If one additional hour of labor in input causes marginal cost to fall, the firm would want to add that hour to continue adding labor to SMC, the short-term marginal cost, becomes positively sloped. We can sum up the profit maximization decision for an operating firm as follows. Produce the level of output such that 1, R equals MC, and 2, MC is not falling. Understanding the interactions between total variable and fixed and marginal costs of output. Exhibit 11 shows graphically relationship between total cost, total fixed cost, and total variable cost. Total cost is summarized by is a summation of all costs, where costs are classified to the basis of whether they are fixed or variable. Total fixed cost, or TFC, is the summation of all expenses that do not change as the level of production. Total variable cost, or TVC, is the summation of all variable expenses. Total variable cost rises with increased production and falls with decreased production. At zero production, total cost is equal to total fixed cost because total variable cost at the point at the output level is 0. The curve of total cost always lies parallel to and above the total variable cost curve by the amount of total fixed cost. As this total fixed cost, it has remained constant even across the increase in quantity. The total variable cost starts from 0. Now the total cost is total variable cost plus total fixed cost. Therefore, the cost starts at the point in which total fixed cost exists. Exhibit 12 shows the relationship between average total cost, ATC, average variable cost, AVC, average fixed cost, AFC, and the marginal cost, MC curve in a short run. As output quantity increases, AFC declines because TFC, or total fixed costs, are spread over a larger number of units because ATC and AVC takes on a bowl-shaped pattern in which each curve initially declines and reaches a minimum average cost output level and then increases after that point. The MC curve intersects both the ATC and the AVC at the minimum point. Points S and T, where MC is less than AVC, and average variable cost will be decreasing. Where marginal cost is greater than average variable cost will be increasing. So this is the relationship. I actually made a video exactly about this in my IB economics or investment banking economics, so you guys could go and see that. Exhibit 13 shows an example of how total average and marginal costs are derived. Total cost is calculated by summing the total fixed cost and total variable cost.
The marginal costs are derived, total variable cost, marginal cost is derived by observing the changes in total costs. As the quantity variable changes, there is a relationship that always holds for average and marginal cost. If marginal cost is less than average cost must fall. And if marginal cost is greater than average cost must rise. For example, in Exhibit 13, average variable cost begins to increase as output rises from 2 to 3 units because marginal cost 50 is greater than average variable cost 41.7. Also from Exhibit 13, average total cost declines up to 3 units because marginal cost is less than average total cost. After 3 units, average total cost increases because the marginal cost of unit 4 or 85 exceeds the total average cost or the average total cost of all prior units of 75. Initially, the marginal cost curve declines because the increasing marginal returns of labor, but at some point, it begins to increase because of the law of diminishing marginal returns. These are all really fundamental. So here's the graph. Here's the graph continued. As stated earlier, total cost increases as the firm expands output and decreases where production is cut. Total cost increases at the decreasing rate at which a certain output level. Therefore, the rate of increase accelerates as the firm gets closer to full utilization of capacity. The rate of change in total cost mirrors the rate of change in total variable cost. In example 13, total cost 5 units is 400. At which 300 is variable cost and 100 is fixed cost. At 10 units, the total cost is 1,650, at which 550 is variable cost and 100 is fixed cost. So note that the fixed cost remains the same regardless of how much units is produced. The fixed cost is typically incurred whether the firm produces anything or not. Fixed cost may stay the same over a given range of production, but can change to another constant level when production moves outside of the range. The latter is referring to a quasi-fixed cost, although it remains categorized as part of the total fixed cost. Examples of fixed costs are debt services, real estate lease agreements, and rental contracts. Normal profits is also considered to be a fixed cost because it is a return required by investors on their equity capital regardless of the output level. Quasi-fixed cost examples would be certain utilities and administrative salaries that could be lowered to avoid altogether when the output is 0, but when rises to higher constant levels or different production ranges. Other fixed costs evolve primarily from investments in such fixed assets as real estate, production facilities, and equipment. These fixed costs cannot be arbitrarily cut with production declines. When a firm downsizes, the last expenses to be cut is usually the fixed cost. Average total cost has a direct relationship with quantity. When quantity increases, total variable cost increases. The quantity decreases, the total variable cost declines. At 0 production, total variable cost is always 0. The variable cost examples are payments of labor, raw material, and supplies. These changes to total variable cost declines up to certain output points and then increases as production approaches a capacity limit. In example 13, total variable cost increases with an increase in quantity. However, the change from 1 to 2 units is 25 multiplied by 70 minus 50. And the change from 9 to 10 units is therefore it's different. It's 350. Example 14 illustrates the relationship between MC, MTC, and marginal cost, average total cost, average variable cost, and average fixed cost of the data presented in example 13. So that's what it looks like. And they move because of the marginal of the economies of scale, the marginal returns, and the diminishing marginal returns. Dividing total fixed cost by quantity yields average fixed cost. Average fixed cost decreases throughout the production span, reflecting the spreading of a constant cost over more and more production units. At higher production volumes, average fixed cost may be so low that it is a small proportion of average total cost. In example 13, average fixed cost declines from 100 to 1 unit, 100 at 1 unit to 25 at 5 units, and then to 10 at an output level of 10 units. In example 13, average variable cost is 5 units, is 60 multiplied by 300 divided by 5 over initial range of production. Average variable cost declines and then reaches a minimum point. Thereafter, average variable cost increases at a firm as a firm uses more of its production capacity. The higher cost results primarily from production constraints imposed by the fixed asset. At higher levels increases, the lowest average variable cost quantity does not correspond to the least cost quantity for average total cost because average fixed cost is still declining. In Exhibit 13, the average variable cost is minimized at 2 units, whereas average total cost is minimized at 3 units. Average total cost is calculated by dividing total cost by quantity by summing the average fixed cost and the average variable cost. In Exhibit 13, at 3 units, average total cost is 75. Total cost is therefore this. Okay. So here's example 4. There isn't a lot to talk about, just literally examples. 3.2.4 Revenue under conditions of perfect and imperfect competition. Recall from earlier discussions of profit maximizing conditions that a firm can generally be classified as operating in either a perfectly competitive or an imperfectly competitive environment. The difference between the two manifests itself in a slope of the demand curve facing the firm. If the environment of the firm is perfectly competitive, it must take the market price of its output as given. And it faces a perfectly elastic horizontal demand curve. In this case, as we saw previously, the firm's marginal revenue and the price of its product are identical. Additionally, the firm's average revenue or AR or revenue per unit is equal to price per unit. However, a firm that faces a negatively sloped demand curve may lower its price to sell an additional unit so that marginal cost is less than the price of P. These characteristics of marginal revenue are also applicable to the total revenue function under conditions of perfect competition. Total revenue, as always, is equal to the price times quantity. Total revenue equals price times quantity. But under conditions of perfect competition, price is dictated by the market, and a firm has no control over the price. As the firm sells more units, total revenue rises by the exact number of the price per unit. Under conditions of imperfect competition, prices is a variable under the firm's control, and therefore price is a function of quantity, as denoted right here. For simplicity, suppose the firm is monopolistic and faces the market demand curve, which we'll assume is linear and negatively sloped because the monopolist is the only supplier. The total revenue is identical to the last expenditure of all buyers in the market, which means they can jack up the prices all they want and still get the same amount of output. Earlier, we noted what happens as price is reduced and quantity sold increases in the environment. At first, a decrease in price increases total expenditure to buyers and TR, and total revenue to the firm, because the decrease in price is overweighted by the increase in the units sold. But as price continues to fall, the decrease in price overshadows the increase in quantity, and total expenditure or revenue falls. We can now depict the demand and total revenue functions of the firm under conditions of perfect and imperfect competition, and shown in Exhibit 16. So that's what it looks like. So the total revenue curve increases and it decreases because of the diminishing marginal return, the law of diminishing marginal return. Panel A of Exhibit 16 depicts the demand curve, upper graph, and total revenue curve or lower graph for the firm under conditions of perfect competition. Notice that the vertical axis is in the upper graph is price per unit, or e.g. Pounds per bushel, whereas total revenue is measured on the vertical axis and the lower graph, e.g. Pounds per week. The same is true for respective axis of panel B, which depicts the demand of total revenue curve for the monopolist. The total revenue curve for the firm under conditions of perfect competition is linear with a slope equal to the price per unit. The total revenue curve for the monopolist first rises in the range where marginal revenue is positive and demands its elastic, and then falls in the range where marginal revenue is negative and demand is inelastic with output. 3.2.5 Profit maximization, break even, and shutdown points of production. We can now combine the firm's short-run total cost curves with the total revenue curves to represent the profit maximization of the cases of perfect competition. Perfect maximization is MC equals MR. if you guys forgot. Exhibit 17 shows that both AR and the average cost curve are one graph for the firm under the conditions of perfect competition. So that's what it looks like. It may look complicated, but I did make videos about this in previous sections. So if you have questions, be sure to refer to the past videos. The firm is maximizing profit by reducing Q star, where the price is equal to SMC, and SMC is rising. Note that there are another level output of Q prime, where P is equal to SMC, but as the point of SMC is falling, so this cannot be a profit maximizing solution. If market prices were to rise, the firm's demand and MR curve would simply shift upwards. Okay, so it's quite straightforward. All right, 3.2.6 break-even analysis. A firm is said to break even if its TR is equal to its TC. It can also be said to that a firm breaks even if its price of average revenue is exactly equal to its total average cost, or average total cost, which is true under conditions of perfect and imperfect condition. Of course, the goal of management is not just to break even, but to maximize profit. However, perhaps the best the firm can do is cover all its economic costs. Economic costs are the sum of total accounting costs and implicit opportunity costs. A firm's whose revenue is equal to its economic cost is covering the opportunity cost of all of its factors of production, including capital. Economists will say that such a firm is earning a normal profit, but not a positive nomic profit. It is earning a rate of return on capital just equal to the rate of return that an investor can expect to earn in an equivalently risky alternative investment or the opportunity cost. Firms that are operating in a very competitive environment with no barriers of entry, from which competitors can expect in the long run to be unable to earn a positive economic profit, the excess rate of return will attract entrants who would produce more output and ultimately drive the market price down to the level at which each firm is at best just earning a normal profit. This situation, of course, does not imply that a firm is earning zero accounting profit. Exhibit 19 depicts the condition for both a firm under condition of perfect competition in panel A and a monopolist in panel B, in which the best each firm can do is to break even. Note that at the level of output at which short-term marginal cost equals marginal revenue, prices is equal to average total cost, hence economic profit is zero. So profit maximization is when MC equals MR. So this is MR, and MC is this. So MC equals MR is right here, which is equal to the point of average total cost. Therefore, this perfect competition firm is breaking even. Likewise, where is MC? Here is MC. Where is MR? MR is right here. The level of MC equals MR is the same as the total cost. So therefore, they're also breaking even. Okay, the shutdown decision in the long run. If a firm cannot earn at least a zero economic profit, it would not operate because it is not covering the opportunity cost of all of its factors of production, labor, and capital. In the short run, however, the firm might find it's advantageous to continue to operate even if it is not earning at least a zero economic profit. The decision that follows the addresses the decision that continues to appropriate the earn negative profit or shut down operations. Recall that typically some or all of the firm's fixed costs are incurred regardless of whether the firm operates. The firm might have a lease on a building that it cannot avoid paying until the lease expires. In this case, the lease payments is the sunk cost. It cannot be avoided no matter what the firm decides or what the firm does. Sunk costs must be ignored in the decision of continue to operate in the short run. As long as the firm's revenue covers at least its variable costs, the firm is better off continuing to operate. If a firm produces If price is greater than average variable cost, the firm is not only covering all of the variable costs, but also a portion of its fixed costs. For example, suppose a firm is producing 100 widgets and sells them at a price of €4 each. Obviously, the total revenue will be 400 per time period. Suppose also that the level of output or average total cost is €7, made up of average variable cost of €3.75 and average fixed cost of €3.25 per period. This firm is said to be earning negative economic profit, also referred to as economic loss, a condition in which revenue falls short of total approximate referred as economic loss. A condition in which revenue falls short of total opportunity cost of €300 because of its total cost of being 700 and its total revenue of being 400. Should the firm shut down immediately if the fixed cost is unavoidable? So this is examples of fixed cost. Okay, example 5, not so much to see there. Given the relationship between total revenue, total variable cost, and total fixed cost, example 22, which is right here, example 22, summarizes the decision to operate, shut down predictions, or exit the market in both the short run and the long run. The firm must cover its variable cost to remain in business in the short run. If the total variable cannot cover total variable cost, the firm shuts down production to minimize the loss. The loss would be equal to the amount of fixed costs. If total variable cost exceeds total revenue in the long run, the firm will exit the market to avoid the loss associated with the fixed cost at zero production. By existing in the market, the firm investors do not suffer their erosion of the equity capital from economic loss, where total revenue is enough to cover the total variable cost, but not all of the total fixed costs. The firm can continue to produce in the short run, but will be unable to maintain financial solvency in the long run. When evaluating profitability, particularly profitability, particularly for startup firms and businesses using turnaround strategies, analysts should consider highlighting break-even and shutdown prices in the financial research, identifying the unit sales levels at which the firm enters the level of production range for profitability, and at which of the firms could no longer function as a viable business entity, provides invaluable insight for investment decision. 3.3, understanding economies and diseconomies of scale. Rational behavior dictates that a firm selects an operational size or scale that maximizes profit over any time frame. The time frame that defines the short run and the long run for any firm is based on the ability of the firm to adjust to quantities of fixed resource in use. The short run is a time period during which at least one of the factors of production, such as technology, physical capital, or plant size, is fixed. The long run is defined as the time period during which all factors of production are variable. Additionally, in the long run, firms can enter or exit the market based on decisions regardless of profitability. The long run is often referred to as the planning horizon, in which the firm can choose the short run position or optimal operator size in which the firm can choose the short run positions of the optimal operating size that maximizes profit over time. The firm is always opening in the short run but planning in the long run. 3.3.1, short and long run cost curves. Recall that when we addressed the short-run cost curve of the firm, we assumed that the capital input would hold consistent. That meant that the only way to vary output in the short run is to change the level of the variability input. In our case, labor is the capital input, namely plant and equipment. Were to change, however, we will have an entirely new set of short-run cost curves, one for each level of capital input. The short-run total cost includes all of the inputs, labors, and capital the firm is using to produce output. For reasons discussed earlier, the typical short-run total cost, STC, curve might rise with output, first at decreasing rates because of specialization economies, and then an increasing rate reflecting the law of diminishing marginal returns. Okay, so here's what it looks like. The slope decreases and it increases. This reminds me of calculus so much. I don't know why. Okay. Prime this, don't prime this, multiply, negative prime this, don't prime this, divided by v squared. Anyways, plant size 1 is the smallest and of course has the lowest fixed cost, hence this the STC1 curve has the lowest vertical intercept. But note that STC1 begins to rise more steeply with output reflecting a lower plant capacity. Plant 3, so this is just illustrating it. Definitions defining economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. We literally talked all about these in our previous video, so you have to just go look back on my channel and look at the previous videos and you'll see it. When a firm increases all of its inputs in order to increase its level of output, obviously a long-run concept, it is set to set up its production. Scaling down is the reverse decreasing of all of its input in order to produce at least in the long run. Economies of scale occurs if at the firm increases its output, cost per unit of production falls. Graphically, this definition translates to RLAC, the long run average cost curve, and its negatively slope. Example 24 depicts this definition translated into the long run average cost curve, the average cost curves with the negative slope. Exhibit 24 depicts several SATC curves. SATC curves, one of each plant size, and an LRAC, the long range average cost curve, representing economies of scale. So in the long run, the price per unit decreases. However, in the short run, it has these bows. Okay. These economies of scale occurs if cost per unit rises per unit. Graphically, economies of scale translate to long run average cost curve. So economies of scale translate into the long range average cost curve, which with a positive slope. Example 25 depicts several SATC curves, one of which is plant size, and other envelope curves, and an RLAC curve representing these economies of scale. As the firm grows in size, economies of scale are lower ATC can result in the following: increased returns of scale. Having a division of labor and management, being able to afford more expensive yet more efficient equipment, effectively reduce waste and lowering costs, making better use of market information and knowledge, obtaining discounted price on resources, for example, if you buy in bulk. A classic example of a business that realizes economies of scale through greater physical capital investment is an electric utility. By expanding output capacity to accommodate a larger consumer base, the utility company per unit cost will decline. Economies of scale helps explain why electric utilities have naturally evolved from localized entities to regional and multi-regional enterprises. Walmart is an example of keep costs and price low. Walmart also uses the latest technology on monitoring point-on-scale transactions, decreasing sales and returns, which is where a production process leads to increasing in output, and that proportionally smaller and then smaller input being so low that can be calculated by profit by properly managed. Overlapping the duplication business function of the product line, higher resource prices because of supply constraints below where buying important large quantities before it is okay. The minimum point of RLAC is least. RLAC is referred to the minimum effect of scale. The minimum efficient scale is the optimal firm size under the perfect competition over the long run. Theoretically, perfect competition forces the firms to operate at the minimum level of RLAC curves because of the market price will be established at this level over the long run. If the firm is not operating at the last cost point in the long-term variability, there will be threatened. So this is what it looks like. Example 7 is here. Okay. Summary. Quite a bit. This reading addresses several important concepts and extends to basic market models of demand and supply to assist in the analyst in assessing a firm's break-even and shutdown prices of production. Demand concepts covered include own price elasticity of demand, cross price elasticity of demand, and income elasticity of demand. Supply concepts covers includes total average and marginal product of labor, a total variable and marginal cost of labor, and total and marginal revenue. These concepts are used to calculate the break-even and shutdown price of production. Elasticity of demand is a measure of how sensitive quantity demands to change in various variables. Own price elasticity of demand is the ratio percentage change in quantity demand by percentage charge of goods or services is price. If own price elasticity of demand is greater than 1 in absolute terms, demand is inelastic, and a decline in price will result in higher results of expenditure on the children. Higher total expenditure on the goods. If own price elasticity of demand is less than 1 in absolute terms, demand is inelastic, and a decline in price will result in lower total expenditure on the good. If own price elasticity of demand is equal to -1, demand is unit or unitarily elastic, and the total expenditure good on the independent or price own price elasticity of demand will amount always to be negative. Income elasticity of demand is the ratio on the percentage change in quantity demanded to the percentage change in consumer income. And demand is negatively sloped because either the substitution effect or the income effect. The substitution effect is the phenomenon in which a good's fall price more of its good in substitutes for other more expensive goods. The income effect is the phenomenon in which as a good's price fall, real income rises, and if the good is normal, more of it will be purchased. If a good is inferior, the inferior effect will partially or fully offset the substantiation effect. There are two exceptions to the law of demand: Griffin's goods and Veblen goods. Griffin goods are like supreme products, right? They're highly expensive, all solely because of brand loyalty. Griffin goods are highly inferior and make up a large portion of the consumer budget. What did I say? It should be Veblen goods then. I'm not quite sure. Okay. A large portion of consumer, as the price falls, the substitution effects tends to cause more of the goods to be consumed, but a higher negative income effects overwhelms the substitution effect. Demand curves of Griffin goods are positively sloped. Veblen goods are highly valued, highly priced status goods. Consumers may tend to buy more of a good if its price rises. If income elasticity of demand is positive, the good is a normal good. If income elasticity of demand is negative, the good is an inferior good. Cross price elasticity of demand is the ratio of the percentage change in quantity demanded for one good to a percentage change in the price of a related good. If cross price elasticity between two goods is positive, there are substitutes. Cross price elasticity between two goods is negative, there are complements. The law of demand states that that a decrease in price will cause an increase in quantity demanded. Total product of labor is the short run concept that a total quantity is able to be produced for each level of labor output, holding all other inputs constant. Average product of labor, or APL, is the total product of labor divided by the labor hours. Marginal product of labor, MPL, is the change in total product divided by the change in labor hours. MPL might rise as more labor is added to a fixed amount of capital. The law of diminishing marginal returns dictates that additional outputs must fall as more and more labor is added to a fixed amount of capital. Production cost increases as input prices rise and falls as input becomes more productive. Short run total cost, or STC, is the total expenditure on fixed capital plus the total expenditure on labor. Short run marginal cost, SMC, equals the ratio of wage to marginal product of labor, MPL. Average labor cost, or AVC, is the ratio of wage. We had that right. Marginal revenue is the price times quantity sold. Marginal revenue, MR, is the ratio of change in revenue or change in output. Delta revenue over delta outputs. Firms under conditions of perfect competition have no pricing power and therefore face a perfectly horizontal demand curve at the market price. For firms under conditions of perfect competition, price is identical to marginal revenue, or MR. Firms under conditions of imperfect competition face a negatively sloped demand curve and have pricing power. For firms under conditions of imperfect competition, marginal revenue, or MR, is less than price. Economic profit equals total revenue, or TR, minus total economic cost, whereas accounting profit equals total revenue minus the total accounting cost. Economic cost takes into consideration the total opportunity cost of all factors of production. Opportunity cost is next best alternative foregone in marking a decision. Maximum economic output. Profit requires 1 marginal revenue. MR equals marginal cost. MC, and 2 MC not fall within output, or not to be falling within output. The break-even price occurs when the total revenue, or TR, equals the total cost, TC, otherwise stated on the output quantity, at which average total cost, ATC, equals price. Shutdown occurs when a firm is better off not operating than continuing to operate. If a fixed costs are sunk costs, then shutdown occurs when the market price falls between minimum average variable cost. After shutdown, the firm incurs only fixed costs and loses less money than it would do operating at a price, then it does not cover variable costs. In the short run, it may be rational for a firm to continue to operate with earning negative economic profit, or losing money, in other words, if some avoidable fixed costs are covered. Economies of scale is defined as decreasing long-run cost per unit as output increases. These economies of scales is defined as increasing long-run cost per unit as output increases. Long-run average total cost is the cost of producing per unit of output under the conditions in which all inputs are variable. Specialization effect is bargaining power, which input price can lead to economies of scale. Bureaucratic and communication breakdowns of bottlenecks that raise input prices can lead to diseconomies of scale. So this is what causes this economies of scale, and what causes the marginal revenue or the marginal cost to go up after it dips down and reaches the minimum. The minimum point on the long run average total cost curve defines the minimum effect scales for the firm. Okay, so lots of these concepts we have all talked about in my previous videos of investment banking, of IB economics, and I do hope my readings have been helpful. And without further ado, thank you for coming to reading 14. And it really goes really fast. It skips a lot of concepts. It goes through a concept really fast. In my undergrad economics course, this whole reading 14, cost me like 3 months to go over, because we go a lot into depth. But this the CFA level 1 economics reading for reading 14 is actually just skims through it. It actually doesn't go into a lot of depth, and it is just goes through a lot of the main topics, and that's it. So I do hope my reading helpful, and the show notes are linked below, where you could go on Amazon to buy the show notes. And without further ado, here's reading 15. If you have questions, you guys could leave it in the comments. And I do hope my readings have been helpful. We are really making good progress, and now a quarter of the way done. And I hope to see you guys in the next reading about reading 15. And goodbye, guys.